Hi, Bob from INSYDIUM here. In this video we're going to take our fluid particles and colour them with gradients and create an animated ocean surface. So let's start by taking our scene where we left off, and we're going to make these particles look a little bit more interesting. These three different emitters, instead of them having separate colours each, we'll map some nice gradients to these particles based on their speed. So what we'll need to do, let's come down in our object manager and we'll just switch off our cache. So we'll be simulating this through again, and we can make invisible our base particles, these blue ones that they're floating on top of. We don't need to look at those. And let's go to our emitter green, blue and red. And what we're going to do here, actually before we change the colour, let's just go to the emission tab. Now these emitters aren't set to emit particles until start emit frame 100. But actually our base particles settle so quickly we don't need to wait 100 frames. Let's just put this down to say 15. So they'll start emitting after frame 15. So we can't see our base particles, but they're there, and there we get our coloured particles. So let's turn those off, and we're going to go to, we'll highlight all of them and go to the display tab. And let's make some adjustments. First of all, we'll change the editor display from squares to dots, and we're going to change the colour mode from single colour to gradient parameter. Let's just make a little bit more room here. So what this is going to do in gradient parameter mode is going to take whatever gradient you define here and map it to a particle property. By default, that gradient parameters map to the age. We want to map it to how fast they're going, so let's put speed. Now what this is saying is when they are 0 centimeters speed, they will be this blue colour, and when they are 100 centimeters per second speed and above, they'll be white, and anything else in between, they'll be somewhere along this gradient. So if we hit play, you'll see that happening. The fastest moving particles are going to be white, and the slower ones will be blue. So they're all pretty quick when they start, and then when they start slowing down and getting to the end, they'll gradually start turning blue again. Okay, so that's how it works. Relatively easy to understand. Let's highlight all of those emitters again. So what we'll do is we'll change this gradient per emitter, so they're all slightly different, but we'll change them all at the same time at the beginning and then just make some little tweaks. So let's just get rid of these two middle knots and delete those out. And when they are slow, let's say that we want these ones to be a pretty dark purple, something like that. We'll put another knot, so when they get to a lot of speed, let's say that they go even darker and then they gradually go white when they're fast. Let's just see. We may change this, we may not. Let's have a look. Hit play. So now we've got these really dark purpley bits on the outside, and they're all getting to this white colour too quickly. They only have to be going 100 centimeters per second to be white, and we've got too much white. So let's increase it so they have to be going faster before they become white. 150. Yeah, look, that's calmed it down somewhat. And we've got these nice kind of dark bits as well. Let's just go to that and we'll darken that up even more. Yes, look, we're getting this really dark purple. Okay, that's looking cool. So that's our colour for one of them, but then we want to change the other two. So let's make some adjustments. First of all, our emitter green, it's no longer green, is it? So let's go to the basic tab and we'll call this one purple. Purple, there we go. And let's go to the emitter blue. So we'll just do this one now, and let's go to the display tab. And with this one, let's add a little bit of a different colour within that. So we could just try look by putting a knot here, and let's make this maybe a cyan colour. We'll just crimp in these bias points so it's it'll take up a smaller part of that range. So now we should have pretty similar, but with some kind of cyan looking particles as well. Okay, that's looking cool, adding a bit of variation to it. Could perhaps move this knot up a bit that way. Yeah, that's cool. Okay, that's good. And then in the red one, let's add a knot. And to kind of go with this scheme, I'm going to go with a kind of a more of a green, a very light kind of green in there. Something like that to change up the red. Yeah, so now we're getting a bit of green, perhaps a little bit too much. Let's just reduce the saturation. Okay, so that's looking pretty cool. Let's play it from the beginning, see what we get. So obviously you just put whatever colours will match the scheme in which you are working towards. But I have the freedom here of just picking whatever, so we'll go with these colours. So this cyan is a little too murky for my liking. But with honesty, when it comes to actually rendering this properly, you're going to be using kind of emission shaders to make this really glow and pop. So for this viewport preview, these colours are going to be fine. So that's obviously looking really different and way more detailed now we've added that colour mapping to those particles. So we can kind of leave it at that for now. Okay, so that stage is done. Before we recache this though, we need to get our ocean surface sorted. So that's what we'll look at now. So what we will do, first of all, let's just switch off all of these emitters for now. And we're going to go and bring in an xParticles generator. So let's go to our generators menu. And in here, you'll find an xpOcean. Let's bring it in. Now, by default, it brings in what looks like a deformed plane. And if we hit play, we get this animated ocean surface. Let's just hit NA to hide the lines. What we'll do here is let's just make a very simple ocean material to make this look a little bit more water-like. We'll go into our material manager, double click. We'll put this on our xpOcean. Let's go into the settings by double clicking. I'm going to take off reflectance, and we're just going to do a bit of a trick using a Fresnel shader in this texture menu here. So if we come into this down arrow, we'll pick a Fresnel, and it basically maps this gradient dependent on the angle at which the surface is in relation to the camera, so you can see it working, and it gives a really good and fast in the viewport representation of what looks like a reflective surface. So that's really cool. So we'll leave it just at that. Let's change the color though. So we'll go into the gradient settings, and this knot will make it a really deep, rich blue. Something along those lines. We're going to come in like this, and then the white, let's just take some of that white brightness out. So we'll bring in a bit of saturation, reduce the lightness, maybe reduce that saturation now actually. So we can go with something like that. And obviously we don't need to labor over this. This is just for the viewport. So let's close that down, close our material manager, and now we have got something like this. So now we've got our sim going. We don't actually need to be looking at this wireframe of our collision object either. So let's just go down. It's this cube. Let's make that invisible. Then we don't need to see it. So in our xpOcean, let's have a look at the settings. We hit play and we get this nice animation, but we want ours to be acting a little differently. So first of all, we're going to just reduce that wave height a bit. So that obviously makes, if you reduce it down, it's making the waves less high. We're going to reduce the time scale so it's not moving as quickly. We are going to increase the wind speed. Now, increasing the wind speed will create a much larger, more kind of languid looking swell. So look, if we increase this wind speed up, you can see that it's getting much bigger. And if we just make the wave height bigger again, just to demonstrate, can you see we're getting a much bigger kind of swell now because we increased that wind speed. So let's put our wave height down again. We don't need that much. And what we're able to do is we can add some choppiness, which kind of almost like crimps in the distortion. You can see if you go too far, it folds in on itself. So you want to be looking at the peaks, and let's just dial it back so we've got a bit of that nice definition that choppiness gives us without breaking the mesh. So that's looking pretty cool. I'm pleased with that. That'll do. Could perhaps just drop that wind speed down a bit so it's not quite as hectic. drop my wave height a bit. All right, so we can leave it at that, but obviously you can make adjustments however you like. So that is our xpOcean. However, this is just using it as a primitive, as its own object. We are not going to do that. We are going to use xpOcean as a deformer. So all we need to do, and when we do this, it'll work like any of the Cinema 4D deformers. Here's the menu. Look, all of these deformers that you'll be used to using, you make it a child or a sibling of an object and it deforms it. Well, we could do the same with xpOcean on any object. All we need to do is go to our xpOcean and change the type from primitive to deformer, and now it'll just work as a deformer. Obviously, it doesn't have any geometry to deform just yet, so it's not doing anything, but it will in a moment. Right, so that's our xpOcean. Let's just switch that off. So now what we need to do is create the geometry which we're going to deform with this. And what are we going to use to do that? Well, we are going to use our emitter base particles. So let's switch these back on and we'll view them. So these are our particles which are driving our fluid sim. And look, they're just dropping down and we're getting a bit of animation in here because they're being affected by our NX turbulence modifier. Now actually that turbulence modifier, we only really want it to be affecting our coloured particles. So we could go to our emitter base, to the modifiers, and we're already discluding all of these modifiers. Let's just drag in, let's have a look, what do we want? Turbulence. Let's drag in the turbulence as well. And now that turbulence won't be affecting these base particles and they'll just drop and then they're staying there not doing anything. Right, let's close down those Nexus options. So now what we're going to do, we're going to generate a mesh from these particles. So let's go to generators and we're going to bring in an xpOpenVDB mesher. And in the general tab, in the general settings, it's saying what object do you want to mesh. So let's just drop in our emitter base. And there we have a mesh based on those particles. Now, if we hit ND, we can see the lines and see the polygons. What we could do is we could reduce the point radius, which is a bit like a particle radius multiplier. It kind of creates a sphere, a meshed sphere around each particle, and then those all interlock, and then it gets the surface from those interlocking spheres. But if we put this down to, say, 5, there we go. That's looking much better. So then we have this live mesh based on our base particles. But if we activate our xpOcean, because it's a deformer and it's a sibling of our OpenVDB mesher within this generators folder here, look what happens. The OpenVDB mesher gets deformed as well. Brilliant. And this will animate along. So look, if we hit play, it's updating this in real time, it's animating it. Let's hit NA to hide the lines. And now we're getting our ocean on our OpenVDB mesher. Let's move the material that we made from the deformer now to the mesher itself. And now you can see, look, let's make our base particles invisible. And now we have got our mesh is being deformed by that ocean. Now we're getting relatively slow playback here, but that's because we've got all of these particles which per frame are being meshed, and this the mesh of our OpenVDB mesher here is updated every frame. It's a dynamic mesh, so there's loads of calculations going on, and then it's being deformed by our ocean. So what we are going to do is we can get this cached up, and then obviously we'll be able to play it back and it's not having to do all of these calculations in real time. So we're going to do that. But one really cool thing to show you before we do cache is not only can we use this xpOcean to deform our mesher, we can also use it to deform our coloured particles. So they'll have their fluid sim, but they'll also move correctly with the waves of our ocean. And all we need to do to set that up is to go into our, let's activate our emitters again. If we go into all of these emitters, we go to our modifiers. Now in our modifier tab, look, we're excluding the constraints, so they're not constraining the other emitters, but we want to include this xpOcean deformer to deform the particles. So if we drop this in, make sure it's ticked to say it will work, now we can cache it and it's going to work. So let's get this sorted. We'll go back to the first frame. We're going to go to our cache. We're going to activate the cache. We're going to overwrite this cache. So let's just build cache, overwrite existing, and it's going to cache through. Now this is going to take a little longer than it did before because obviously it's calculating this dynamic, dense OpenVDB mesh, but it's still not going to be the end of the world, between 3 and 5 minutes I'd imagine. So I'll pause it now, come back to you when it's done, and we'll have a look at what we've got. So our cache is finished. It took just under 5 minutes, and now we have got this. Now we can see a difference here. We definitely, as I'm scrubbing through, you can see that our particle color has been cached, and we can see that deformation by the ocean. But where's our mesher? And if I let go, suddenly the mesher appears. Now we have to set this up now to get this to work correctly. Otherwise, you're not going to see the correct image in the viewport, and it's an order of operations issue that we need to sort out. So first of all, the first thing we need to do, now that we have cached our particles, we need to ensure that our xpOcean is no longer going to be affecting them, because it's a deformer. It can continue to affect them, and they can effectively be deformed twice, from the cached position and then again from the live deformer. So let's go to all of our emitters, go to the modifiers tab, and let's just switch that off. So that's no longer going to be affecting them. Okay, so now if we just hit NA to hide the lines, now our OpenVDB mesher is cached, but the deformation isn't cached. So if I switch off our xpOcean, you can see, look, we can scrub through the mesher, but it's not being deformed. It's being deformed live. But what happens is, if you see the mesher, it disappears, and then we let go, and then it loads and reappears. So what we can do, we can get around that very easily just by sticking our OpenVDB mesher inside an xpJoin object. So let's go to generators, and let's go to, actually not generators, no, my mistake, utilities. And inside utilities, we're going to bring in an xpJoin. This join, let's just bring it up into our generators folder here. We're going to put our OpenVDB mesher as a child of the join, and then we can just make the ocean a child of that generator. So now this join and this xpOcean are siblings, so they'll be affecting each other, but because we've put that in the join, we can now scrub through. Now that's cool. Now the only thing we need to do now is, you'll see that our particles are slightly being gobbled up by this ocean. And that's because of the way in which the OpenVDB mesher works. It's basically expanded those base particles, and we need to just move it down a bit. So let's just take our xpJoin, go to the coordinates, and look, we can just knock it down until we can see our particles, something like that. So we've moved it down -7 centimeters. Now the particles are slightly floating on the surface, which is what we want. And if we hit play, now we've got a scene that we can play through, and there we've got our really cool animating particles, and that's looking excellent. Just so we can see it a little bit easier, let's go to our emitters, to the display tab, and we'll change it from dots to squares. And then if we click force display, then we'll see them as squares. Now that's made them a bit too big, but here's a cool trick. If we take the display size factor, we can just put it down to 50%. So now they're bigger than the dots, but not quite as big as the standard squares. Now arguably, our white ones, we have a few too many white ones. But that could provide some nice illumination at our render time. So that's looking pretty cool. But there's an amazing trick that we can do there with our xpOcean and our particles to get our particles to still have a fluid sim, but to follow the undulations of this animated ocean. And that's looking really cool. Very, very pleased with that. And that is the basic technique of how we got our animated colour fluid particles.